Good afternoon. We're about ready to start our program, so if you all could move to your seats.
Great. Well, welcome everybody. It's great to see you in a beautiful, beautiful day in San Francisco. I was just mentioning to Jerry that he's bringing the nice weather from LA. Last year, we also had a beautiful day. It's like, wow, we're lucky. It's not always this sunny in San Francisco, but I'm happy you could join us. We have a combination of people who work in the area and law students, so it's great to have this type of event. This is the 6th annual UCLA and UC Law SF economic forecasting event. So it's a great partnership. We bring together economic forecasting and law and policy, which is both our schools' focus. And I'm Evan Epstein. I'm the executive director of the Center for Business Law at UC Law SF. By the way, for those of you who don't recognize UC Law SF, it's UC Hastings. But this year, we changed the name to UC Law SF. And so this year we are hosting an event with a theme, and every year we pick a theme. So I just looked up what we had, at least from 2020. At that time, we addressed bankruptcy law, thinking that the pandemic and COVID-19 was going to have a lot of impact to our companies. In 21, we talked about post-COVID-19 developments and what was the environment as well for the tech industry here in the San Francisco Bay Area. Last year, we talked about ESG, environmental, social, and governance. This was a big topic. Interestingly, this year, there's a big backlash against ESG, but it's still very important, at least in governance terms. And this year, we're going to talk about geopolitics, China, and the future of tech. It's a huge topic, and we are very, very fortunate to have experts with us to talk about this. We have Professor Keith Hand, who's from UC Law SF. He's the director of the Center for East Asian Legal Studies. We have Kerr Gibbs, who is an expert as well. He's lived in China for many years, and he just wrote a book about this topic, so we have a lot of experience there. Hartley West, she's a partner of one of the leading law firms in the Bay Area. Ex-DOJ will talk as well about legal implications, what's going on in that side of things. And we also have a couple of FBI agents. So we're going to talk about national security, cybersecurity, and other issues that are impacting the environment. So with this, I just want to thank UCLA Anderson for partnering with us, for doing this. I also want to thank the Bay Area Council for hosting us in this beautiful venue. I don't know what is all that banging, but I would be calm. And don't worry about it. It's just the water. And if you have any questions, we are totally open to having an interactive discussion. In fact, my experience, it's always better to have an interactive discussion that makes the event better. We're going to have a reception at the end, so if we don't respond to all your questions, we'll be hanging out here, and we'll be happy to talk to you for longer. So with this, Jerry, I'll hand it over to you, and I look forward to a great day with you.
Thank you, Evan. And welcome. It's a pleasure to be back here in the Bay Area. And I'm going to kick this off with the economic outlook for the US and California. And yes, by all means, if you have questions, please raise the questions. Can't promise I'll answer them, but feel free to raise the questions. But before we start, I'd like to recognize our sponsors. Both of our institutions are public institutions, and the Bay Area Economic Council is a nonprofit, and we couldn't do these kinds of programs without the help of our sponsors. So we are most appreciative. Our principal sponsors today are RSM and Yamava Resort and Casino at San Manuel. Platinum sponsors, law firm of Allen Matkins, California Bank and Trust, Cathay Bank, Clark Construction, Leap Development, and University Credit Union. At the gold level, United Airlines. At the silver level, Jackson Square Partners and Ken Broad, Manufacturers Bank, Warland Investments Company, and Chip Robertson. And at the Bruin level, the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco. So we are most appreciative, and Maybe we did bring the sun up from Southern California. So you're welcome. But we don't get any rain in Southern California, so send some our way, please. So let's see, George, can you bring up the slides or do I just click? There we go. So I've titled this The Unexpected Robust Economy. So robust because the economy keeps chugging along, keeps adding jobs, keeps adding more goods and services. And so it seems to be really robust. Unexpected because the vast majority of the economists predicted back in 2022 that we were going to have a recession by the end of 2022. Then that didn't happen. And they said, first quarter 2023, second quarter of 2023, third quarter of 2023, where we get a 4.9% GDP increase. And so this is unexpected. I have to say for the forecast, what we did, because the vast majority of economists were saying we're going to have a recession, we said, maybe what's happening with the Federal Reserve, pictured here on the left-hand side, will induce a recession. So we're going to show you what the economy will look like were we to have a recession. And we basically said, choose your own scenario, but we did not call a recession. We're past that now. So for 3 quarters, we gave 2 scenarios. And I think when we were here last year, we had 2 scenarios. So let's jump in. So our roadmap is the macro outlook, GDP, interest rates, and the like. And then we want to look at interest sensitive sectors. Interest rates have gone up rapidly and remain high. And so they should be affecting the interest sensitive sectors. And we want to look and see what's happening there. And then we'll look at some other sectors and then turn to the California outlook. Before we get to that, I want to make one point, which I think is a really important point. And if you only take one thing away from my talk, please take this from it. When big events happen, like the pandemic, but any really big event, changes occur in the economy. Preferences change, the structure of the economy changes, and that means that looking at past data, while it's informative, is not as good a guide as it once was. And we're going to see that in the data that I wanted to show you. So let's jump into the macro. And so this is GDP growth, seasonally adjusted annual rates. And we had it going up to 2.7. We were one of the high ones, and it came in at 4.9. So amazing growth. One of the things, if you look, kind of decompose that, you see that consumers were spending, inventories were starting to go down, and so firms were starting to rebuild inventories. And so don't expect really that to happen. Again, we have it then coming in at 2% in the current quarter. Might be slightly lower than that, depending on what's happening with inventories. And then we've got a 1% economy through this year. 1% economy is for a couple of reasons. One is the interest rate increases, the higher interest rates are going to slow the growth of interest sensitive sectors. They're not going to send it into a recession, but the growth is going to be slower. The second is we don't have real confidence that we're going to get a budget out of Washington. You might disagree, but there's at least some evidence that there's gridlock in Washington, and we're not going to get a real budget out of that. That means we're going to get something that looks like continuing resolutions, even if it is couched in 12 or 13 expenditure bills. And those continuing resolutions don't allow for new programs and new spending. And so government spending is going to be muted at best. And some of the things like in the Infrastructure Act, are not going to take place in this coming year. And those two things are going to give us the 1% economy, but then we grow back to trend. And another way to look at GDP is through levels. And so these are the blue is the levels of GDP, the red is our forecast, and the dashed line that you see here is the 2018-2019 trend. But we have an unemployment rate of 3.8%, was generally considered full employment. So one of the things that happened with the pandemic was that we had millions of boomers retire, and they're not coming back. So if you look at labor force participation rates, the labor force participation rates for Americans of prime working age, 25 to 55, is up, and it's above pre-pandemic. But for boomers, it dropped, and it stayed. It came back a little bit, but then it stayed lower, and also for under age 25. But it's really the boomers that impact this. And when you have fewer people out there working, you have smaller potential GDP. And if you just adjust for that, you get a new line, and we are just right on potential GDP. And that's what the Fed is worried about. Low unemployment, we're at potential GDP, a real concern about overheating the economy and the inflation rate going back up. And if we look at inflation, so I've got two lines here, the headline and core. Headline is in ochre, I guess, or brown or something. The headline inflation, and that went higher than core. Core inflation excludes the more volatile food and energy. And this is year over year. So just a digression on inflation. If we go out in the street and we start asking people, what's inflation, the inflation rate today, you're going to hear big numbers. The inflation rate today is like 3.3, 3.4%, and that's what's been running the last 3 or 4 months. And here we've got 4.3 for 4.3 is for core, and 3.7 for and that's year over year, not the last 3 months. 3.7 for headline. The way in which most people think about inflation is not the way economists or policymakers think about inflation. They think about, I went to buy a car, and it was a lot more expensive than the car I bought 5 years ago. Or I go to the grocery store and I buy eggs, and that cost me a lot more. And so their frame of reference is not year over year, but it may be over a 2-year or 3-year or 4-year span. And that's what's sticking in people's mind when they think about inflation. But the inflation rate has come down, and the inflation rate has come down, and then we have it kind of flattening out and ending up at the end of 2025 with core inflation at 3.2%, headline at 2.8%. We think the Fed is going to be satisfied with that. Not that they're going to say we've changed our target from 2%, but rather they say we're moving in the right direction. We don't need to shock the economy with really high interest rates. And I want to show you why that's the case. So this is the cumulative contribution to the consumer price index. And the way to read this is the orange plus the blue is everything to the left. The way the consumer price index is calculated is that the Bureau of Labor Statistics takes a sample of what households buy in the US, and then every month they go out and see what happened to the cost of that basket of goods. Okay? And they do make adjustments from time to time in that basket of goods. But what they do is they weight each item, because they don't take the price of something like toothpicks and add it to the price of automobiles. They weight it by the percentage that's in our budget. So if you see on the left-hand side, pretty far to the left is the fourth one is alcohol. Alcohol prices have gone up by a lot, but for the average American household's budget, it's pretty small. So it gets a small weight. There are, of course, some households where it's pretty large, but on average across the US, it's pretty small. And as you move across here, for this metric that the Fed uses, the Fed actually uses a slightly different metric, but very similar result. If you move across here, you find that you get all the way over to the right-hand side and you have almost no inflation. And then you get two things that are driving the inflation rate. The first one, so it's the second from the right, is other transportation. And if you look into other transportation, it is automobile repair. Okay, and the cars we drive today are increasingly electric cars. They have driver assist. They're very different from the cars we used to drive. And that means that the repairs are much more expensive. And just to illustrate, has anyone replaced a windshield recently? And if you don't mind, how much did that cost? How much? $2,000, and you may have gotten a bargain. But it used to be that mine was $2,700. That's why I said that. It used to be you had a rock would hit the windshield, right? And a guy would come out to the house, he'd pop the windshield out, pop another one in, seal it, $300. Now you have to take to a specialist who takes the sensors off, puts the windshield in that can actually carry the sensors, puts the sensors back in and calibrates them. That's highly skilled labor. So increasing interest rates doesn't change that. The next one is shelter. And this is rents. Now rents are coming down. Vacancy rates for apartments is up. It's up to 6.6% now. But rents are paid under long-term leases. And when those long-term leases come due, or when people move out of rent control apartments, you get a rebasing of the rents. So the rents keep going up on average. And it takes a long time for that to get out of the system. And so increasing interest rates doesn't change that. And the Fed knows this. So if this is all that's driving inflation, well, we've got another one here that's actually negative medical services, but that's going to go up with the new health insurance premiums. But these are not things that the Fed can actually affect. And if other prices are coming down as they are, we think that the Fed is going to say, we're taking kind of a longer view, things are moving in the right direction. We don't need to keep increasing interest rates. And that's the signal they're giving. So here is what we think the Fed is going to do. We think they're going to have another 25 basis point increase. We put it in November, which is now. They're probably not going to do that. It's probably going to be December or early next year. But just as a way to say, yeah, things are moving in the right direction, but we're serious. And then they're going to hold it constant in the low fives. But you remember that 1% economy? As they see the economy weakening, our view is that they're going to do a couple of 25 basis point decreases, also to say, if things keep going badly, we will step in just to calm markets. But 25 basis points is really not much. So we've got a couple of those built in, and then in the upper fours, about 4.8%, they hold constant. Now, for a long time, markets thought that the Fed wasn't serious about keeping interest rates high for longer. Now they're starting to see that. We're starting to see the yield curve move towards turning right side up from being inverted. And it has the 10 minus 3 has a couple of times, but then gone back to slightly inverted. It's really kind of flat now. And so we have coming into the next quarter, the yield curve goes right side up. And we look at these interest rates and year over and over again, interest rates are high. Actually, interest rates are pretty normal. What is unusual and extraordinary are these zero interest rates. But these interest rates that we have, given the rate of inflation, pretty normal. They're not really high. They're not the 20% interest rates that we saw in the in the early 80s that gave us big recessions. Okay, so let's turn to interest sensitive sectors because this is the important part. Interest rates went up. What did the Fed affect? And the first that I want to look at is housing. So again, because of the pandemic, we've got to be really careful with data. And if you look here, there's a surge in building during the pandemic and shortly thereafter. We had a lot of migration in the US as people migrated to Phoenix, to Las Vegas, and Salt Lake City, and so on. New homes needed to be built. And so we had this surge of building. That's over with. So let's compare a normal time to a normal time, pre-pandemic to current. And if we go back here, 2018, 2019, 4.1% is the 30-year fixed mortgage rate. And we're building at about 1.3 million per year. Slightly higher, but not much. Now we look at today, or at least what's in this circle. I know mortgage interest rates are a little higher today. They went up, they've come down just slightly. But 7.3% is the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate in this period. And we're now building above historical average. We're at somewhere between 1.46 and 1.53 million per year. So interest rates went up and building went up. Exactly the opposite of what we see in the historical reference. And so you have to ask, well, why is that? And there are two reasons. One is in the US, we have not overbuilt housing. We grossly underbuilt. And we think about it in terms of California, but it's true all over the US. We're underbuilt in housing. And the second is when interest rates, those extraordinary zero interest rates that we saw, which gave rise to 2.5% to 3% mortgage rates, were out there, people refinanced. And now they're saying, I've got a 2.7% mortgage and I'm going to upsize or downsize and get into a 7.3% mortgage? No, I don't think so. I'm going to wait. And yeah, question. This is these are new building permits without regard to who buys them. So yeah, part of it can be corporate buyers who are then going to rent. But it is all homes. So it includes apartments. It's all housing units. So if you're building an apartment building and it has 25 units in it, that adds 25 to this, not one. So it's the number of homes. And so that's been increasing. So people aren't selling their homes. And we see that, in California, we know this, but true all across the country. We're at kind of depression levels of sales of existing homes. But at 7.3%, with an economy that's been booming, there are people who can afford that and want to buy homes. They can't buy existing homes. They go and buy newly built homes. Builders are saying, I can sell everything I've got. My inventory is going down. Let's build some more. And that's what we're seeing here. And that's not what we saw in the past. So that's always been a big driver of recession. My colleague Ed Leamer wrote a paper years ago that said housing is the business cycle, because except for coming back from wars or the dot-com bust, all of the recessions that we've had since World War II were, if not caused, at least exacerbated by huge declines in home construction, and we don't have that today. Okay, so let's look at some other interest-sensitive sectors. This is autos, and you see the big drop in auto production during and after the Great Recession. We kind of come back to normal, but we don't make up for that. And then we get the pandemic, and then it kind of comes back right away, but then we get chip shortages. We haven't overbuilt autos. The US auto fleet, the average age of the US auto fleet has been increasing. So people need cars and they're out buying cars. And then we've got a dip here. That's the UAW strike. And we only have this coming back to average, not actually making up for the deficit. So we might be too low here. And that 1% economy might be a bit higher. Depends on how fast the auto manufacturers can expand production. So that interest sensitive sector is going the opposite direction. And this is an important one. This is business investment in durable goods. And that also turns down with interest rates. And if you look over on the right-hand side, it didn't do that. Orders are up. Now, this is X transportation only because Boeing is huge in this. And they'll make a sale in October of 100 airplanes and nothing in November. And that just causes volatility. But it, on average, it looks the same. But you see the growth is slowing, right? And that's part of why we have that 1% economy. We're not getting that rapid growth in durable goods orders. And then the next one I think is really telling. One of the things that's different right now is we have industrial policy in the US, and we didn't have that before. And that's partly an outgrowth of the past couple of years, partly an outgrowth of what we're going to talk about later in the program, which is US-China relations. Yes, question. Right, so this is real durable goods. Yeah, and if you look at the backlog numbers, the backlogs are up and orders are up. And this, I think, is a really interesting one with industrial policy. So if you look here, going across from left to right, this is the building of new factories. Not much change. And then it just goes vertical. And this is happening all over the US, including here in California. Lots of new factories going up. That adds to the demand for construction labor. It also doesn't seem to be affected by interest rates because the subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act and the subsidies in the CHIPS Act means that if you want them, you need to move now. Okay, so let's look at some other sectors. And I want to look at consumption, defense, and tech. So consumption first, this is real. So this is inflation adjusted. Consumption, and you see before the pandemic and after, and if we draw a trend in here, we're above trend. And we're not converging on trend. We're continuing to move away from trend. We're outspending. So remember what I said, big events cause changes. And one of the changes that seems to have happened to the American public from the pandemic, and maybe from all the other uncertainty in the world, is that we are much more willing to spend today for today's enjoyment rather than save for a much more uncertain future. And we postponed a lot of gratification or a lot of consumption, particularly of services, of experiences while we were locked down. And so people are going out and they're spending and they're continuing to spend. Consumption demand is 2/3 of GDP, 2/3 of GDP demand. So that's not being affected. And then we have defense. We know this is a much more dangerous world. And if anything gets through Congress, it's going to be an increase in defense spending. The good news for California is California disproportionately produces defense durable goods. And so that's a demand for our manufacturing here. No one likes to see a world where you need to build more defense goods, but that's the world we live in. And our allies in Europe and Asia, they're buying more defense goods, and about 40% of that demand comes to the US. So these are all the headwinds that the Fed has been going against as they try and really cool the economy and think that they're going to get a recession to bring inflation down. It's really one of the few times when interest rates have been going up with contractionary monetary policy and fiscal policy is going the other direction. And it's going the other direction in a big way. Okay, so let's turn to tech. This is national. This is real output of two sectors, professional, scientific, and technical services and information. These are tech-centric sectors. There's no real tech sector. It's spread through many sectors, but these are the most tech-centric, and you can't see any contraction here in spite of the headlines that we see in the paper and kind of what we feel in, in California. So for the US, income and employment are strong. And in spite of the fact that people feel bad about other people's economy, people feel good about their own personal economy. That's why they're out spending. The interest rate rises probably have cooled the economy, and we have it cooling economic growth in the coming year. But the impact has really been relatively mild. And infrastructure and defense are going to add demand to the economy next year and the year after. And we do know a recession is coming eventually, because it always does. But we have no recession, as you saw in this forecast. So let's turn to California. Oh, no, we need to do this. Risk to the forecast, because there are many. Yes, question. So the savings rate is the amount of your current income, of your paycheck, that you're putting away in saving, rather than the amount that you're taking out of existing saving. So and the savings rate has come down. It's still relatively high compared to before the Great Recession, but people are spending more out of their incomes. They have been taking what was called excess savings and spending that. For the vast majority of American households, that's spent. That's all gone. And still we're seeing this growth. Where we see from the studies that I've read, this is not my research, studies that I read, what we see is that excess savings, in quotation marks, is with the wealthiest Americans. And so they have the lowest propensity to consume. So that consumption is coming out of current income. Yes, question. Slightly, yes. Yeah. So the interest rates coming down, they're only coming down slightly. And just as a way for the Fed to signal, if the economy dips into a recession, we're going to do something, but it doesn't dip into a recession. How do we define a recession? So it's kind of common to say, well, 2 quarters of negative GDP, but a recession is about economic activity contracting. So that means fewer people working, more idle workers, less capital working. So capital utilization rates going up. And we don't see either of those. We have more people working. So we actually, first 2 quarters of last year, we had negative GDP. However, we had more people working and more capital working. So the economy was actually growing. And so that was a kind of measurement error. So that's really where you have to look to see, is the economy contracting or not? And that would be a recession. And there's another question. So that's possible, but we're seeing kind of across the US, consumers are spending, right? That migration might have done that. But from high cost states to lower cost states, at least some of that, and you can think about this area, were people who could work remotely, right? And so they're moving to places where they can get more housing, for example, because if you're in a studio apartment here in the city with a laptop on, on the bed, you might want to move someplace where you actually have a home office. A lot of that migration that we saw, though, was from, for example, this part of the Bay Area to Sacramento, not far away. And with hybrid work, it's going to be much more difficult to live in Grand Junction, Colorado, and work in San Francisco than to live in, say, Sacramento. So we're seeing some of that maybe coming back. Okay, so risk to the forecast, what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Russia, Ukraine. I mean, it looks like those are kind of localized. There's no guarantee there, right? And we can add to that China, Taiwan. And I think what we need to keep in mind was 1914, August 1914, a war started that no one wanted, a huge war because of mistakes. So we need to keep our eyes on this, because this, if any of this happens, just, throw our forecast out. Election worries. As we get into 2024, I mean, I think Americans who are not political junkies, which means almost everybody, but not everybody, are not thinking about the election at all, right? And typically don't. But as we get into 2024, if it looks like either the Congress or the presidency is really up for grabs, since the Republicans and the Democrats have radically different economic policies, that's going to create uncertainty, and uncertainty creates more conservative investment, and that durable goods investment that you saw, that could easily turn down. And then climate change migration. So climate change is obviously happening, and migration is starting to happen. We see it at our southern border, but for our economy, that's not a big deal. But if you look at low-lying areas in Asia, that's the industrial, that's the factory for the world, including for a lot of us. And supply chain constraints could happen if these low-lying areas start flooding. And I think about the flood that happened in Bangkok to Western Digital, and they threw everything at it, and it took them a year, which surprised everyone because everyone thought it was 3 years. It took them a year to get back online. We could get massive disruption by this, and then as people migrate away from those areas, you lose the workforce, even if the plant and equipment comes back. So something to keep our eyes on. Okay, let's turn to California. The way we do our California forecast is we take the US forecast and we say, what is different about California? And of course, one thing that's different is we lean to the left. I love this picture of your city. But there are other things that are different that would give us a different California forecast. But let's start off by simply asking, is all the stuff that we read in the East Coast press accurate about California? So this is GDP growth, 2019 quarter one to 2023 quarter one. This is the latest data that we have. It kind of doesn't matter where you start this, you're going to get the same result. And these are the states, these are the large states, the ones that actually make up GDP. 29 states in the US have 1% or less of GDP. So like if Delaware were to grow at 10%, which would be outstanding, you'd never see it in the data, not in the national data. But these states, you definitely would. So here's California, it's growing faster than the US. And we have the usual suspects here, Florida, Arizona, Texas, over to the left. But there are two ways you can get more GDP. And I alluded to this earlier. You can have more people doing stuff. That'll give you higher GDP. It's why China, with 1.4 billion people, has the second largest GDP in the world, but it's a really poor country. Or you can be more productive, have higher wages, have wealth accumulation. So what we know that there was a lot of this migration that happened during the pandemic. So we want to sterilize from that, from just having more people doing stuff. And when you do that, California is the fastest growing state in the US. They do move the needle, but they, yeah, so New York is there now because New York had outmigration, but productivity went up as well. So this is productivity gain, but what you don't see there is Texas. And I mean, Texas is a great state. But the people moving into Texas were had lower education, lower productivity. So on average, Texas didn't grow as fast on a per capita basis. Now, that's not a bad thing. People who have lower productivity and lower incomes also need to have a good life, and they can have that in Texas. But the fact is that California is over here on the left. So this is not the Rust Belt. Not to say we don't have problems, and I'll get to that with the risks. So here is California payroll jobs, and dropped by 16% in the pandemic, is now 2.5%. This is through August. The September numbers didn't change this much. So 2.5% above the previous peak, which is why if you're driving on the roads during rush hour, you don't see much difference. Even with all those people leaving California, certainly in my neck of the woods, traffic is as bad as it ever was. And if we break that down by sector, what we see is, and this illustrates why California's GDP is growing faster than others. So we have, when this was reformatted, the arrows moved to the left. Ignore the arrows. What we have is logistics, tech, professional, scientific, and technical services, construction, durable goods manufacturing. When we think about durable goods manufacturing, we think about Rosie the Riveter, right? Now it's Rosie the robotics technician. And things that are being built in California, the B-21 bomber in Lancaster. In Roseville, we have semiconductors. In Lathrop, a big new factory by Tesla to build batteries. And you know, Tesla knows about building batteries in Nevada and in Texas, but they're also building here. And so this is where you get the growth. And over on the right-hand side, non-durable goods is negative. Non-durable goods includes food processing, and that has been impacted by the weather last year, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley. And we kind of see that here in the regional job gain. Most regions in California through this year are growing faster than the US. Some a little slower, San Diego and Silicon Valley and the Inland Empire, but the San Joaquin Valley is negative. And so this is, you know, in addition to the farm workers, this is the truckers, this is the food processors, everyone who was going to be taking things out of the newly minted Tulare Lake can't do it. Okay, so talk about tourism. This is on the top line on the left-hand side is international arrivals at LAX. The bottom line is SFO. It looks like international tourism is increasing and coming back. It's not. This is us going to Italy and Japan and returning home. But what is happening is a lot of domestic tourism, and I think this is really telling when we think about what is happening in leisure and hospitality. So this is passenger arrivals in wine country. And the bottom line is the pandemic. The next couple of lines are immediately after the pandemic and also the 2 years before the pandemic. And the top two lines are now. Record arrivals at Charles M. Schultz Airport. The thing that's important about leisure and hospitality for California relative to the US is this one on the left-hand side. And that is a lot of what we're missing here are Chinese tourists. Chinese tourists didn't come because of zero COVID. Now there's some visa problems. When that gets straightened out, they're going to start coming, and they just showed in the last holiday that they're ready to travel again. In 2018, 1.8 million Chinese came to California. When they come to the US, they go to San Francisco, Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and New York, which means that even in a weak economy where some of this starts to abate, we're going to get a disproportionate share of foreign tourists. And that is going to mitigate any of that relative to what's happening in the nation. And this is manufacturing, and I've already really talked to this, I'll go through this really quickly. Transportation equipment, computers and peripherals, machinery, semiconductors. Semiconductors is about zero, but we have a number of new semiconductor factories that are going to be coming online this year and next, including some that are moving out of Texas to California, which is kind of surprising, but is in fact happening. And this is defense spending. And these are the states that get defense money. It's only a few states. And when you call out the ones that are producing durable goods, Texas, California, Connecticut, and Arizona, and that's about it. So we get a disproportionate amount of these defense orders. And that again means California should be doing better than the US. And by the way, the aerospace industry that left California in the 1990s, it didn't leave. We have the largest aerospace industry in the country, and it's growing rapidly. Okay, so let's turn to tech employment. This is professional, scientific, and technical services again. This is employment in California. You can't find the layoffs here, right? We know there were layoffs. You saw it acutely here in the Bay Area, but those folks were rehired. And one of the reasons why they were rehired, something that I think you all know, is AI. And money is coming into AI. No one wants to be left behind. And so you have a lot of new AI-centric firms that are starting up and hiring these people who are being laid off. You see the same thing in Seattle. When Amazon had these big layoffs, NPR in Seattle had a story about how the smaller tech firms were really happy about that because they didn't have to compete with Amazon for talent. And they were now able to hire and to grow. So housing and home prices are down 6.7% from that pandemic peak. But if we look before that, home prices are actually up in California. And the latest Case-Shiller shows home prices up in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego. Now, part of the reason is there's not anything to purchase. And this is the median home price. Case-Shiller takes individual homes and multiple sales. And so Beyonce and Jay-Z really kind of pushed that metric up with their $200 million house. You've seen the pictures of it, right? Oh, you should see what $200 million buys. It's in LA. It's really ugly. Which shows you that money does not necessarily buy the best architects. Okay, so to wrap this up, leisure and hospitality, we have the potential for more international tourism than other parts of the country. Manufacturing, high tech, and defense and aerospace are going to push our manufacturing at a higher growth rate than the rest of the country. Tech, AI is the new darling of the VCs. And construction, which we haven't talked a lot about in California, but construction, our new housing laws, the 3 from the Senate and the 3 that started in the Assembly, have opened up a bunch of new products like ADUs that weren't there before and that existed in other states. And so we've seen disproportionately California's housing construction doing better than elsewhere. And industrial building, factories and warehouses. So the demand for construction labor remains high, but risk to the forecast. So I'd be remiss if I didn't bring these up. Housing and homelessness. So high price of housing and the perception you can do better elsewhere. So if you go to Austin from LA, you can't. Or if you go from Sacramento to Boise, you can't. But the perception, homelessness, urban public safety, and climate-related drought and deluge. I mean, these are things that are risk to the California forecast. And just a few numbers just to wrap this up. You see a slowing California economy, increase in unemployment rate, but kind of moderate and in that sense, very similar to the US, just a bit more moderate than the US. And I will finish it with that. Yes, question. Commercial real estate is really interesting because it depends on what you're in, right? Office space. Okay, so if you look at office space, it looks quite a bit like retail did about 5 years ago. There needs to be adjustment in office values, which will be followed by adjustment in rents. There also needs to be a decent definition of how we're going to work and how much space we need and what the configuration is. All of that takes time. So, we do a survey over 8 markets in California, and we don't see much new office construction happening in the state going forward. But other parts of commercial real estate, retail, has finally bled off most of its redundant space. And we're going out to stores now because we want to be with other people. And it definitely is. I mean, we're just in the beginning of this, and we're seeing those office buildings that are selling at huge discounts. How much of a risk is it to the banking sector? I think it's probably more in community banks. Shameless plug. First week of December, we're going to actually have a conference on that on our next Anderson, because we want to get to the bottom of that. Kind of what is really going on with the debt overhang in office space, and how much will be kick the can down the road. Yes. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing smaller firms hiring, and we're seeing really good hiring numbers. Uh, what we've seen in big firms like Meta and Google and Amazon and so on is that they're in their life, the part of their life cycle where they needed to and are continuing to evaluate, do we have the right product line? Did we start something that's not really going to earn a rate of return? And the best thing is to get rid of that and close it down. And so that kind of restructuring is sort of normal in the life cycle of companies. And these large tech companies that all kind of grew really rapidly at the same time are actually doing that restructuring now. The other restructuring that you see of the big companies is fairly small compared to their labor force. But the real hiring that we see, and kind of all the the payroll job numbers have been good, including the latest ones that just came out. So that's still going on. Yes, question. Yeah, we're expecting the 10-year treasury to stay high and the yield curve to go right side up. So, so the 10-year treasury will be up around 5% and we'll kind of stay there. Now, one of the things to keep our eyes on is, I had that risk to the US forecast and all those things are going on abroad. And if you have wealth that's at risk in any of those places, where are you going to put the money? Right here. And that will drive down those yields. I think 5%, 4.5 to 5.5%, that's kind of historically normal. We're just really used to these low interest rates, but that's what's extraordinary. How are we doing on time? Okay. Okay, so short answer, it's a real problem for third world countries, particularly if they have dollar denominated debt. Okay, so now thank you. So now I'd like to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Sean Randolph, who is the director of the Bay Area Economic Council. And Sean, take it away. It's all yours.
Thanks very much. This is the clicker device, I guess.
Yeah.
Another one. Okay. So hi, I'm Sean Randolph. I'm with the Bay Area Council's Economic Institute. We handle the research, analysis, and strategy for the Bay Area Council, and that's where we are today. Okay, better? Oh, good, thanks. So the Bay Area Council is a major business organization for this part of the world. 78 years old, about 350 companies as members. Everything from south of San Jose, Silicon Valley, up through wine country, and now to Sacramento. So we look at economic issues across the state and in the region. So I'll give you a perspective on what's going on right now, we think, in the Bay Area. And I think you'll find a lot of touch points of resonance, maybe with a little more specific detail locally between what Jerry is talking about in California and what we're seeing here in the Bay Area. And little graphic, so we were very, very hot at one point before the pandemic. Cooler now, like where and when do we reach some kind of a happy kind of just right point? And we're in a transition, so we don't know that, maybe going the right way. So briefly, looking at, starting with the US, we've seen fairly consistent, quite consistent job growth coming out of the pandemic, pretty steady across the board in the US. And if we look at California, the US, and the Bay Area, we can see we're all in positive territory. So the employment has fully recovered in the Bay Area from the pandemic. It is 2.5%, rather 0.6% above what it was at the end of 2019, January 2020. The recovery is not as strong by job count as you see in California or in the US as a whole, but we're still in positive territory now. If we look over time here since the beginning of the recession, you can see it's been fairly even recovery of jobs, but not quite as strong lately. And then we lost a bunch just in September. So it's not like we're out of the woods entirely, but we're still into positive territory. If you look, and this connects again to what Jerry was saying about where we're seeing the growth. So this is where employment is compared to February 2020 when the pandemic began. So You heard from Jerry, manufacturing strong in California. We're 6.7% up in manufacturing. Even with the tech layoffs, 6.7% up in employment in information, which includes tech, education, health services, wholesale, transportation, utility. We are still down, like way down, in retail, which is having a hard time, government, financial, and leisure and hospitality. Now, the leisure and hospitality is an interesting story because that was much, much, much further down. I mean, that all but died during the recession. People were not traveling, hotels were empty, there were no conventions. So that down 2.1% is a lot better than it was a year ago. And I think going to what Jerry was saying about tourism, one reason it's not a little bit better is we're seeing domestic tourism back. You walk along the Embarcadero, there's a lot of tourists, there are cruise ships, a couple of piers down, offloading, unloading people constantly. We've got good tourism back from Europe for a while now. Where it's not back yet is Asia. That was in part because China was shut down for a long time. And until actually at this moment, we only have a fraction of the number of commercial flights flying between China and the US of what we did before the pandemic. So there's very few flights, seats are expensive, they're starting to come back, but slowly. But guess what? The biggest spenders for tourism are international, they're not domestic. Who are the biggest international spenders? It's Chinese. And so the Chinese haven't been here for more than 3 years. I think as they come back, I think those figures will continue to improve. You can see again where we've had the growth, the sort of net jobs. It's been in the local serving things. We've had some losses in the other fields. I think it's important to kind of separate the time period though, because you've got number of jobs created or restored over the period of the pandemic, say over the last 3+ years. And then you have, which is all net positive, but there's still movement in the last year or so, which may go in other directions. So got to figure out time frames, whether you're talking about a recovery from February 2020, or whether you're comparing it to this time last year. So we think about San Francisco metropolitan area, I say knowledge jobs in the industry, and sort of comparing where they've been growing nationally. So this is net creation here, and you can see there's been a lot of these jobs now. Dallas, Austin, we've created a bunch in San Francisco and a bunch in San Jose. So we're not doing as well in these fields as in some of the peer regions, although we're still net positive. This gets reflected in also vacancy rates in our downtown areas. Anybody who's downtown here in San Francisco knows the story. Across the Bay Area, still high vacancy rates. Somebody asked about commercial office space earlier. Highest south of Market, financial districts in San Francisco. High still really all around central San Francisco. So about a 34% vacancy rate today compared to maybe 6% in 2020. And again, it's because we have the highest concentration of tech workers of any major downtown in the United States. And guess what? The tech workers have been the slowest to come back. I think it is an interesting thing to think about, though, that we are thinking about this theme of the transition in the Bay Area economy, that a lot of people left San Francisco, they left Silicon Valley during the pandemic. They were in a little apartment, maybe. You didn't have to work in the office, you could be remote. So some people went to Bend, Oregon, or they went to Aspen, or maybe they went to Denver or Austin or various places like that. It turns out that 80% of the people who left San Francisco or Silicon Valley didn't leave California. They went over the hill to the Central Valley in the direction, as Jerry said, of Sacramento. So they're still in the economy. They can drive it. The issue is with the people who went farther away. Maybe you got a lovely spot to live in Aspen or Bend or somewhere, but now companies are starting to get more serious about requiring their employees to be back. They're starting to say for the first time, it'll affect your job assessment, your income, and maybe even whether you're going to continue to work here. So what are we seeing now? We're starting to see housing values dropping in cities like Austin, in part because people are needing to make decisions. They're being called back to the office. You can't commute every week from Austin or some other city to San Francisco or San Jose. So we're starting to see perhaps some movement of people back as there's a return to the office, but it's going to take a couple of years still. Whether people are in the office downtown, of course, affects public transit. And you can see that we're still like way down in terms of our public transit utilization. The ferries have been doing the best in terms of return to public transit. Caltrain and BART doing the worst. Of course, their finances are affected because if you don't have as many people coming into downtown San Francisco, for example, you don't have that fare bucks revenue. So 5 years ago, we were worried about the capacity. They didn't have enough capacity. And now it's actually, how do you fill the capacity you got to keep them fiscally sound until more people are actually coming back into the city and until people, frankly, feel very safe on places like BART, because we have homeless issues and other things that people have said, well, maybe I don't want to go in the office. I don't need to. If I got to go, maybe I'll drive. I don't want to deal with anything on BART. So there's issues around just the experience of public transit. It'll return as people come back to the office, but there's this period of 2 years at least in between when some of the financial issues are going to be pretty large for our public transit agencies. This goes to housing. Of course, housing never goes away as an issue here in the Bay Area. One of our big issues still is homelessness. There's a lot of issues behind that, but a lot of that goes to the failure of cities in California, and I think we're probably among the worst in the state here, to permit enough housing to meet demand. So why is it so expensive? We don't have enough houses. They're not turning over right now because, as Jerry said, interest rates are high, and we're not permitting or building enough of the houses that we actually do need. So you can see San Francisco and Oakland pretty close to the bottom of the barrel. Now, there has been a lot of legislation passed in Sacramento this year, starting to force this issue, to force cities, if they don't do it themselves, the builder's remedy, let the developers build it then. And that seems to be turning a corner, maybe lots of ADUs coming in the Bay Area. We're very involved in that statewide. So there's some good things happening, but you can see there's a long way to go before we have a housing supply that comes close to meeting demand. A word about venture capital. Historically, we've generated or we've attracted about a third of all the venture investment taking place in the United States here in the Bay Area. That's kind of where we are now. So those are venture deals, those are venture amounts. It's a rough year for venture capital here and everywhere, but the Bay Area is continuing to hold its own as, you know, the premier national and global location for venture investment. And that kind of gives a bit of perspective too. We always do look over our shoulders to try to understand, well, what is going on in Texas? What is going on in New York and other places where the media says people are moving to, or tech workers want to move there. But, you know, the fact is, like, the money is still here. So these are the largest metropolitan areas by GDP. And you can see how San Jose and San Francisco, the Bay Area, just continue to dominate the landscape. And it takes nothing away at all from our friends in Austin, but, you know, Austin's kind of down in there. And here we go. And you can also look at it by just the number of unicorns. So, you know, it's a weird year to talk about unicorns because valuations are down, but nevertheless, you can see the extraordinarily large number of highly valued companies, younger companies, right, in the Bay Area. Compared to New York, a much larger place population-wise. And then you kind of look at, I don't think I see Austin there. So anyway, still a massive level of product. There we are, 9, thank you. A massive level of productivity in terms of highly valued growth technology companies. And if some companies move out that are big legacy companies, guess what? There's a bunch of others coming in behind them that are new and growing. And still, of the 50 most highly capitalized US companies, 17 headquartered in the Bay Area, 6 of the top 10. So nothing has changed in terms of the leadership of our major technology companies here. And then that gets us to the whole topic of AI, where the Bay Area, San Francisco, broadly defined, has become really the national and global center, but especially the national center for AI activity. We've had a lot of companies that are big investors in AI, Google, Apple, Meta, and others. But what started to happen a year or so ago was a whole bunch of AI startups got talking among themselves, and something was happening, and generative AI was coming on the landscape. And they started to put the word out to their other AI startups around the country saying, hey, something's happening in San Francisco. This is where you need to be. We need to get together. And there was an influx of younger, really creative AI startups, especially including generative AI types, who came in, and they came in along Hay Street in San Francisco by the Civic Center, named themselves Cognitive Valley. Okay. But then they started to outgrow their space there, and they started to take space in downtown San Francisco. So as Jerry pointed out, we have a big deficit, a lot of empty office space at the moment in the city, but the people who are taking large leases of new space in San Francisco are almost entirely AI companies. And now they're taking hundreds of thousands of square feet of space, and even buildings. And you can see San Francisco and Silicon Valley. So it's San Francisco Bay Area broadly defined. So broadly, this sort of brings us still on this topic of innovation. So the economy can go up and down. Commercial real estate can be really problematic. Public transit can be problematic. It is. But underneath that, the investment in innovation and technology goes on. If the economy is good or bad, that continues. And that's still the lifeblood of what drives the economy here. And again, as Jerry was saying, there's a lot of federal money coming into this, since the US has now pretty much embraced industrial policy, which it hadn't done until now. So we've got semiconductor, the CHIPS Act, putting a lot of money into both semiconductor R&D, but especially manufacturing. We may not build any huge fabs here in California or the Bay Area, but lots of smaller scale semiconductor production, and lots of R&D, supply chain, testing, packaging. So a lot of money poised to come into California, including the Bay Area. AI, applied materials, just showed the drawings for a $4.2 billion center they're opening or building now down in the valley that's going to be focused on AI and manufacturing. So they're not going to be manufacturing chips, but it's sort of AI as it applies to the production of semiconductor chips. So that's something over $4 billion there. And then we've got renewable energy. So the region is pretty much the renewable energy capital in terms of younger companies in the US. So guess what? Inflation Reduction Act pouring money into that. It's just starting to open now. And the federal government just announced a couple of weeks ago the Arches, which is a large federal initiative around hydrogen. And under that, from the Department of Energy, they're creating 3 hydrogen hubs in the US. One of them was awarded to California through the University of California and the president's office here in Oakland, led to a large degree by Lawrence Berkeley Lab. And that's going to be focusing on hydrogen energy. And this goes back to when Schwarzenegger was governor. Remember the hydrogen highway? Well, it hasn't gone away. But this is focusing on not hydrogen automobiles topic, but really replacing diesel, heavy trucks, ports, airports, sustainable aviation. So lots of work to be done. And this is actually focused in the end of the day on manufacturing. So a last word about the global dimension of this. Overseas companies, overseas entities are still extremely active here. They're continuing to pile in to the Bay Area. They even came in during the pandemic. Big presence from Europe, Asia, North America. The only country whose presence here is smaller than it was before is China. And that's it peaked in 2017 and it's gone down since. A lot of obvious reasons, US-China tensions. I think Kerr and his colleagues in our panel may get into this more, but US business surveys across the board in China is showing a decline of confidence in their long-term ability to compete in China, decline in confidence in kind of the business environment, investment environment in China. So they're looking for other places. Maybe not leaving, but they're looking around the world. But it means there's not much new FDI going into China. Venture investment in the Bay Area pretty much plateaued and going down after peaking. Inbound investment from China here, and again, Chinese investment in the US, and went to New York, LA, San Francisco Bay Area. FDI has fallen off a cliff for a variety of reasons. You can't find it now. Venture investment inbound from China, much lower than it was, primarily because of CFIUS, which is a federal agency that reviews inbound investment for security purposes. And guess what? Most of the scrutiny of Chinese investment it's not an absolute barrier, but it's a pretty big disincentive. And so Chinese venture investment here way down. And the US government is even now requiring companies, this is quite new, who are investing in China in certain technology areas to report that investment to the US government. So semiconductors, a big topic. US government over the last 2 years, especially the last year, has limited the sale of advanced semiconductors, including especially most recently those used in AI, restricting those sales to China. They have been restricting the sale of semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China. That restriction of equipment sales really impacts big companies here like Lam Research, Applied Materials, and KLA. And then we look at these pressures more. Now there are restrictions on the sale of AI chips to China. There have been restrictions on the sale of advanced chips to China, but now specific restrictions related to advanced AI chips. And then you have to give a notice to the US government, even if you're selling lower end chips. So the impact here is it makes it hard for companies like Intel and NVIDIA and AMD to sell existing products in China, much less to sell new ones. I think I mentioned the semiconductor equipment manufacturers similarly impacted. So this affects the revenues of our big chip companies. So right now, about 20 to 25% of NVIDIA's AI chip revenue comes from the China market. 10 to 15% of their sales for data centers comes from China. And so that affects revenue, but they would tell you it also affects their R&D because the profits they make from that, a lot of it gets plowed back into R&D. There are waivers from the US. If Korean and Taiwan chip makers are making stuff in China or selling to China, they can continue to do it, but it's only like existing products. If they want to do new sales, new products, maybe not. That is going to affect our equipment makers here as well. So it's a prospective limitation. And then finally, our venture investment going into China was pretty strong. Only last summer, 2022, Sequoia Capital announced an $8.5 billion fund just to invest in tech in China. Well, as you know, in Washington, D.C., that didn't go over very well, not in the Congress. And there's been a lot of heat around that. And so earlier this year, Sequoia Capital and GGB, they split their US and China operations. Just too much heat investing in China from the US. So there are some good stories. Tesla's been very successful in China. A lot of competition there from Chinese companies, but it's a leader in the China market. They're selling cars in Europe that were produced in China. So far they've been successful. TikTok, controversial company, they have 1,000 jobs posting right now in San Jose. So there are things going on that are more on the positive side, if shaky. And so where are opportunities? Well, people talk about climate, aspects of renewable energy, healthcare, ag tech. There's a variety of fields where I think there's opportunity, but you got to pick your way through that field because there's so many obstacles to find where the doors are still open. As you all know, APEC comes here next week. That'll be, what, 20,000 people? Xi Jinping and a lot of Chinese leaders will be here for that. It's probably a good thing, I think, that our governor, Governor Newsom, was in China a couple of weeks ago, set the stage in a very positive way about why China is important to California, the state of California, the California's government looking for opportunities to keep those doors open. climate being a big topic we have in common, but not the only one. So with a big delegation coming here, the floor is set, or maybe the stage set by Governor Newsom, maybe an opportunity to start to set a floor under the relationship and see what we can develop here in the Bay Area, California, with China. So there's a lot we could talk about, but I don't think we have time. So I'll just wrap it up there. I think the bottom line, Bay Area economy very much in transition. You can't say today, this is what it is, because it's different than it was 2 years ago. And I think we have a couple more years to see where we settle out from having been in the middle of the pandemic. Conflicting currents, not all good, not all bad, but generally pointing in a pretty good way, and especially on the international front and the innovation front, which never stops here, despite what may be going on with commercial office space. So thanks very much.
Okay, we're gonna skip the break just because we are out of time. And I'm gonna call the panelists to join me. Okay. So we're gonna move now to the panel on geopolitics, China, and the future of tech. And we've chosen a very specific set of experts for this panel. Maybe I'm going to ask each one to do a very brief introductions of themselves. You do have a brief next to you where there's a long bio of each speaker. So I don't think we're going to use the time for that. So maybe we'll start with you, Kerr, and we'll go down the line.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks to the Bay Area Council and UCLA. So the only thing you need to know about me, I'm a UCLA graduate. So
Okay.
there's that. So now how many Bruins here? Lots. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, we'll do the 8 clap later up on the roof. But no, I went to graduate school at Berkeley, and I work at USF, the University of San Francisco now. I'm a China specialist. But I guess my claim to fame is the former president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. Spent about 20 years in Shanghai, mostly as an investment banker, but then finished up working for the chamber.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keith Hand. I also want to thank Evan for organizing, taking the lead on the panel, and our colleagues at the Bay Area Council, the Anderson Forecast, for putting the event together today. It's a real honor to be here. I teach at UC Law San Francisco and direct the Center for East Asian Legal Studies there. A former corporate lawyer, I've been in and out of China since the early 1990s. Just before taking the academic position here, was working for Yale Law School on a series of cooperative legal reform projects in China. And my research focus is the Chinese legal system.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hartley West. I am a partner at the law firm Deckert, and I lead our enforcement and investigations practice. I'd like to echo the thanks for having me here today. It's nice to see everybody. And most of my matters end up having a China nexus in one way or another. So happy to talk about the law enforcement focus there.
Right. So as you see, we've got different types of expertise. And I'll start with you, Kerr. You just wrote a book on China, and you have spent significant amount of time there and thinking about stories of success, of failure, and you lived through also very challenging times. Geopolitics have changed. And so why don't you tell us about some of this research that you did, time that you spent in China talking to CEOs, and maybe give us in a very short way the last 20, 30 years of evolution between US and China. And I know it's a long time, but your book probably does a much better job of that.
Yeah, Evan, thanks. Thanks very much for the question, and my publisher thanks you as well. So they're eager to sell books, and $29.95 on Amazon.com. They dropped the price, so it's a bargain. Actually, before I take that on, just a quick reaction to some of the previous speakers. Jerry and Sean mentioned it was extraordinary a couple of things that they said that really resonated. One is the impact of China on the US economy and the Bay Area economy, especially that tourism number. But the things that they were talking about, I mean, we've been seeing it. I was in Las Vegas a couple of weeks ago, 0 tourists from China. And that was just incredible. I was also in Nebraska at the Berkshire Hathaway meeting, 0 investors from China. I think we need that back. We need that back. And, you know, zero COVID was part of it. The commercial flights is part of it. You mentioned visas, that's all part of it. But what's also part of it is just overall consumer sentiment over there. Until they get their mojo back, they're not going to want to travel. And so that's a really serious issue. The other thing that Jerry talked about, you know, and I think this comes to this question of economic forecasting, and I'm not sure that we are going to do the economic forecasting on the China market, but I do want to react to, you know, he pointed out the connection between productivity and population growth and equals GDP growth, right? I mean, that was interesting. And I think there's a lot of discussion now in China about, you know, a lot of doomsday people say, oh, you know, China's going to fall off a cliff. And I'm sure, you know, everybody's seen the Peter Zeihan loves to go on YouTube and talk about this cliff. I'm not a big fan of that. And here's why. I'm not a huge pessimist on long-term on China, even though he's right about the demographics, that there's a real problem there, but it's not new. China, the workforce number actually peaked in 2011. So this is not a new story. Second, I would respectfully point out to the Peter Zeihans of the world that if you look at China's extraordinary growth periods, and I'm talking about sort of post-WTO 2001 to 2010 and beyond, that did not see a high population growth. What you saw was a productivity growth. So I would argue that China does not have a population problem, it has a productivity issue. And so watch this space closely as to what Xi Jinping does vis-a-vis productivity. And what I'm talking about is taking the shackles off, stop attacking the tech sector, please. Stop attacking some of these industries one by one. Start investing more in education and things that would drive productivity, which is really what, if you go all the way back, you asked me about the last 20, 30 years, you know, what Deng Xiaoping did, the genius, the economic genius, what he did, he got out of the way. That's what led to the productivity growth in China. So what's going to happen in the next 6 months to 18 months in terms of the decisions that are being made in Beijing? I think that's the point. And what is he going to do? The other thing, I mean, China actually has not, they've invested extraordinarily well in infrastructure, and we had some discussion about industrial policy, things like that. And I think China's done really good things there. They actually have not invested in education as much as you might think. So those are things that could be coming down the line. But sorry, I didn't answer your question at all. You asked about the book. I'll just give a real quick one because the book publisher makes me do this. But no, I'll just give you very briefly why the book and what is it. It was something that came out as I was finishing up my term as president of the chamber. A group of us got together and felt that there was a real problem with the dialogue about US-China, and it had become so dominated by the national security issues and a lot of things that we're going to be talking about here, the lawyers, and the pure commercial discussion was just getting completely lost. And so we felt it was urgent to kind of bring a book out that focused more attention on that aspect of the relationship. So just very briefly, I mean, there's a few things we're trying to do with it. One is we're saying engagement is not dead. The Biden administration, some people in the Biden administration have come out, Kurt Campbell and some of the others, oh, engagement is dead. We respectfully disagree. We think that engagement has shifted, but it is still there. It's very important, probably more important now, especially the commercial engagement is probably more important now than ever. It has changed in terms of our expectations of engagement. In other words, I think in the day, we were expecting just engagement would naturally bring us together and we would sort of converge. That's not happening. And so that aspect of engagement, I think, is dead. And that brings us to the second point, which is in the book, is our political, we couldn't be more different, US and China. But there are ways that foreign companies can be very successful in China, despite the differences. And then third, and we're hoping that policymakers can, there may be something to learn from that in terms of the pragmatic approach that large foreign businesses have taken to be successful in China. And then third, we're hoping to focus more attention on the competitiveness of Chinese companies, which kind of gets lost in the discussion about trade relations and unlevel playing fields and things like that. So those are just kind of three things that we were trying to achieve with the book.
All right. Well, that was very comprehensive. Keith, let's move into the law. So why don't you tell us what's going on? There's been a lot of changes, new regulations, a lot of focus on national security, a lot of focus on trade. And how are both types of regulations, legislations in the US and China comparable, and how do you see those evolving?
I don't think there's any question that legal competition between the two countries is intensifying. And you look back at the last 7 or 8 years, US policymakers have taken a series of actions that have really demonstrated the breadth and the potency of the legal and regulatory tools that are at their disposal to pressure China and Chinese entities. There's so many examples we could list, the findings that triggered the trade war, the passage of FIRMA, which expanded the scope of national security review of inbound investment, pressure on big Chinese tech firms like Huawei, the adoption of legislation to address concerns about human rights developments in Hong Kong and Xinjiang. We could spend the next 50 minutes of the session walking through all the examples. And China's response, I pulled a quote from a recent paper issued by the Chinese Foreign Ministry. The US is developing a massive, mutually reinforcing and interlocking legal system for long-arm jurisdiction to advance hegemonic diplomacy and pursue economic interests. Leading Chinese political theorists are arguing that the US is waging economic war, and it's doing so through legal means. And of course, the most recent example in the eyes of our counterparts in China is Biden's August executive order, which invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and related legislation to declare the development of some critical technologies by countries of concern, namely China, to be an emergency. And that order directed Commerce and Treasury to promulgate rules to restrict outbound US investment in Chinese entities that are engaged in those core technologies. And I think all of these actions have exposed some asymmetries in the capacity of legal tools that Chinese and American leaders have to deploy as competition between the two countries intensifies. And I argue in some of my recent academic work that those asymmetries pose security and political challenges for China's leaders. Xi Jinping recognizes this. He has stated publicly on numerous occasions that China needs to develop a legal deterrent and build out its system of foreign-related domestic legislation as a tool, instrument to be deployed in international struggle. This is a comprehensive effort. It's a key plank of Xi Jinping's thought on rule of law. And we're seeing a mobilization of the whole political legal apparatus, including legislative institutions, even law schools, to implement this initiative. So I think if you take one thing away from my comments today, it's that there is a systematic and comprehensive effort in China to build up this capacity. And I think one aspect of this that is of particular interest to the topic of this panel and this audience is an effort to build out a system of legislation and regulatory countermeasures that parallels US capacity to restrict trade and investment and impose sanctions. There are a lot of different examples we could cite. I'll just briefly mention 3. In 2019, China revised its regulations for national security review of inbound investments, expanded the scope of that review in a way that kind of mirrored the similar US expansion of national security review under FIRMA. In 2020, China adopted new provisions on an unreliable entity list, directing agencies to list foreign firms and individuals who were deemed to endanger China's national security and sovereignty, and impose economic travel restrictions on them. And then a third example we might cite is the 2021 anti-foreign sanctions law, which establishes a legal basis for a range of countermeasures to respond to foreign sanctions against China and Chinese entities, and to address a much broader range of acts that are deemed to endanger China's sovereignty. So when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in August 2022, there was a bunch of military, assertive military exercises that took place. There was also a legal response. China invoked the anti-foreign sanctions law to impose sanctions on Nancy Pelosi and her immediate family members. One final point I might make here is that there's a lot of discretion and kind of vague language that's embedded in these laws and regulations, and I think that gives Chinese policymakers a great deal of flexibility. They can respond to foreign provocations in a tit-for-tat manner, or adopt more pragmatic responses as political conditions require. And that uncertain flexibility creates uncertainty, but there's a silver lining, because I think it gives the Chinese government some off-ramps that might kind of help keep this legal competition from escalating.
Let me ask you one question around some of these tools. So one of them, CFIUS, you talked about FIRMA, which is this law to restrict foreign investments in national security. So obviously anyone who's in tech understands that now Chinese investments have a much higher threshold and potentially cannot invest in certain areas. The US is now looking into outbound investments, meaning US investments in China are going to be restricted. And as recently as yesterday, there was a story where a lot of Chinese investors are VC investors, venture capital investing in AI US companies, and nothing's been done from the US perspective there. But how do you see that development, and certainly restricting US investment outside? What do you think about that movement?
I mean, the numbers suggest FDI flows in both directions are on the decline, right? The Rhodium Group published a really interesting report recently, shows a decade-long decline in US direct investment into China, reaching its lowest point, I think, in almost 20 years in 2022. And there's been a pretty significant drop in Chinese direct investment in the United States. And all of the factors that our speakers before in this panel will be engaging, I think, are cited as some of the reasons.
Okay. Hartley, you are, there's a question here. So I'm going to repeat the question just for the audience and YouTube. So the question is, do these investments or non-investments balance each other between the US and China?
Analysis on that question, but there was a really interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal yesterday that I thought set up the panel pretty nicely. And it showed that, I think the statistic was that outbound investment from China exceeded inflows of investment in the last quarter for the first time since 1998. So I think that speaks to some extent to your question.
Okay. Yeah. So the question again, for those viewing this presentation is there an ability to track these investments between China and the United States?
I'm a legal scholar. I analyze political legal texts, so I'm not very well placed to address that question.
I can.
I think perhaps you can. But, a trend line. I mean, I think the trend lines.
So Hartley, I want to ask you, since you are a private practitioner, you are representing clients, companies, individuals in court, and you've dealt with a lot of Chinese nationals and cross-border issues. Tell us a little bit your experience. Maybe how are US enforcement agencies looking at this? How is it impacting people on the ground and maybe in courts?
Yeah, thank you. So to pick up on something that you were just saying with regard to the mobilization of tools, that's something that we're seeing across law enforcement as well. We have seen, I mean, this isn't new, the laser focus on China. It's been increasing, and I'd say in intensity over the last couple of decades. Everybody's obviously familiar with the China initiative that was adopted under the Trump administration that was really an effort to focus on criminal prosecutions of trade secret cases and prioritization of matters that frequently would have been resolved civilly before. That obviously was rolled back with the Biden administration, but the focus on China has not rolled back. And so we see with the House Select Committee on China, you know, they were talking about the investments in venture capital companies. We've seen a number of our clients already getting letters issued by the House Select Committee. I grabbed a quote that I thought was interesting with regard to the committee in terms of its statement of its broad authority really being to investigate and submit policy recommendations on the Chinese Communist Party's economic, technological, and security progress and its competition with the United States. But really, we are seeing through the first hearing, the Select Committee cited statistics about China's theft of US trade secrets and IP, costing the US economy between $200 billion and $600 billion per year. There's really a big focus, and again, not new, but increased intensity in trade secret theft cases, economic espionage cases. But one thing that I think maybe has shifted more in the last several years is really viewing, and I think this goes to the mobilization of all tools, almost any case that involves a Chinese defendant or putative defendant really sort of takes on national security importance in a way that I don't think we used to see quite as much before. So for instance, I had a case that came in the beginning of this year. It was a very wealthy Chinese national who's on the board, the chairman of the board of a publicly traded company in China, and his role here in the United States was a small-ish real estate company, and the focus of the U.S. government charging not Foreign Corrupt Practices Act (FCPA) that many people may have heard of, but rather local corruption charges, just using the wire fraud statute and turning what our defense was turning what is routine hospitality in Chinese culture of meeting with people who are potential stakeholders, which would include local officials, and building trust over a meal, that kind of routine hospitality here, turning that into a quid pro quo and criminalizing it. Now, that matter, we were able to argue successfully. There were a number of proof problems that the government would have, you know, much of it coming down to the Chinese hospitality and really is there an intent to commit a bribe? And ultimately, we were able to get the case resolved with what's called a deferred prosecution agreement, which means that if no further crimes committed for 3 years, the case will be dismissed. So no admission of guilt, great outcome for our client, but really to me illustrates what we see happening a lot on the law enforcement front in cases involving China, and that is this mass politicization of these cases and a rush to charge because there is political pressure. Perhaps the government doesn't even have the evidence. In another case in which I was involved, a lot of the evidence remained in China and in Taiwan. The case was charged. The case was going to trial. The government didn't have the evidence. I mean, this case was stayed for years, and then ultimately there needed to be a several months long break in the trial. Again, this is a trial here in the Northern District of California, because the defense should have a right to put on its own evidence, and they couldn't get that evidence. And this goes to what you were saying about Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. The China blocking statute, which comes into play when you have these cases involving China and there's evidence there and China says, you're not getting that evidence to the United States. Well, how does that trial get put on? And everything was slow rolled even more than before as a result of Nancy Pelosi's visit. This was just we're not going to release anything. And so the trial had to be stayed for many, many months. But let me answer the question that you asked, sir, which is how do people even know? Well, there are law enforcement tools to be able to tell. Do those get employed in every sale and every circumstance? No, they don't. But there is this cooperation between nations through different treaties. Well, many have through different treaties and others don't. It's through diplomatic relations. So for instance, there's no mutual legal assistance treaty between the United States and China. However, Taiwan, which also doesn't have a treaty, has a longstanding history of cooperation, diplomatic cooperation, informal communications between law enforcement. When I was a prosecutor, I had matters where I was able to get information from Taiwan. We saw that same thing happen in the case that was stayed for many months. So it can be a little bit more sometimes of a time-consuming process. And then the same thing, for instance, if assets are in Cayman or BVI or elsewhere, going through those time-consuming processes to get it. But from a law enforcement perspective, there's certainly a way to do it. One more thing just to touch on in terms of the political emphasis here on China is earlier this year, the Department of Justice announced the Disruptive Technology Strike Force. Again, it's not specifically named as being targeted at China. However, if you look at the cases that are being brought under this umbrella, we see it's basically China and Russia. And there were a few cases just in the last few months that are here in California where it's source code, it's software, it's automotive, AI manufacturing that's really just a focus on anything. If it's important technology and it involves China, it's going to be a national security priority.
It's really interesting. One of the thoughts, or at least lines that people use a lot, is the uncoupling of the US and China economies, or as some other people are calling it, a de-risking. Now, my question is, what does that mean? Can we actually uncouple? How intertwined are the economies between each other, and how realistic do you think this idea of uncoupling? Obviously, there are hawks, people politically driven to say there's a huge risk, and others that are very connected economically. But how do you think of this idea between uncoupling or de-risking? Maybe, Kerr.
Sure, yeah, let's talk about the decoupling, de-risking. Just a quick comment about some previous points. I want to point out that the link actually between the export controls and the outbound investment rules. And from a business point of view, because this is something that I talk to CEOs in China about quite a lot. And if you ask them, are the U.S. export controls impacting your business in China? It's like talking to GM or Ford or these kind of companies. And they say, oh yes, absolutely. The export controls are definitely having an impact on my business in China. What are you doing about it? Investing more in China. Why is that? Are they kind of deliberately trying to thwart the US government? No. Their business model is based on developing IP in one place and utilizing that design or IP everywhere. If you design that thing in Detroit, you're subject to US export controls. And so you can only use that in the North American markets. You can't use it in China. If you develop that same IP in China, you're good to go. So that's I'm not saying every American company does that in every situation. It's not, but it's something to think about. And we've talked to people in Washington, D.C. about, they're aware of that. This is not new to them, but it illustrates the challenge of restricting investment flows and these export controls. I don't know. Do you have a reaction to that? I get the sense you have something to add. No, that was my thought. That was just my thought. As you were talking, as you were talking, that sort of popped in my head. I thought it'd be useful for people to hear about. Decoupling. Oh, yeah, sure.
Understanding that you are about the relationship between China and the U.S., given this move towards authoritarianism and at the expense of economic growth. And President Secretary talked about that, and it's great that Xi Jinping's going to be here next week, but everything we're seeing is China is pivoting away from the U.S., helping out Russia with war there in Ukraine, looking to Africa. I mean, all these indicators show that pivoting away from the U.S. not moving.
Let me repeat the question for those listening. So, how sanguine are you in this distinction where maybe the Chinese government has been pivoting in an authoritarian perspective and away from the U.S., and how does that impact your view?
Yeah, I'm pretty concerned about it. I'm concerned about the developments happening in China, mostly for China. It's the direction. I'm not convinced that Xi is a pragmatist. I'm convinced he's very ideological. I think there's a lot of comparisons to Mao in terms of how he does things, how he goes about things. I would argue he's not pragmatic at all. I mean, the famous quote, from Deng Xiaoping, about cats, hey Mao, bai Mao, dua lao shi zhao Mao. If, as long as it's a black cat or a white cat, as long as it catches a mouse, that's a good cat. Xi Jinping, I don't care about the catching mice. That cat had better be a red cat. So that's a problem. Now, does that make China fundamentally incompatible with the relationship with the United States? I don't know. I mean, Nixon and Mao were able to find a way to get a relationship, even though it was much more ideological in 1979 than it is today. So a relationship is possible. Again, I think we need to be pragmatic, and I think that the commercial lane is extremely important in this respect. But thanks for the question. I mean, that is the question.
I just add, I think the creeping authoritarianism, and in particular the 2018 constitutional amendments that dismantled term limits for the presidency and sort of paved the way for Life Xi's to rule for as long as he wishes, and that explicitly incorporated the leadership of the party into the operative provisions of China's constitution. It sort of stripped away the facade that China is on this slow but incremental liberalization path, and that's fueled a lot of the arguments on Capitol Hill that our engagement policy was wrong and we need to start to decouple. And it's fueling the politicization of these investigations and the pressure on companies like Huawei, all of the actions we've been talking about.
So the question again, I'll repeat it. Is there a domestic impact in China around these policies?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's huge. Yeah, and this goes to where we started this conversation, is people in China are in a funk. They're just really depressed and not feeling confident about the future. And I think this is part of it is zero COVID, coming out of zero COVID, everything that happened to them with the lockdowns, but a lot of it is this too. I mean, they've had a taste of freedom. They've had a taste of what it could be like, and now they feel like things are going the other way. So I think for the first time in a long time, I think you actually do have to ask the question about stability and what's going on over there. I don't think that the demonstrations that happened earlier, were anywhere near the scale of a Tiananmen of a 1989, but it certainly wasn't a demonstration of their happiness and glee with the current administration, put it that way. More questions, or you want to? This does pivot actually to decoupling, but far away.
So the question, I'll repeat it, is fencing off US companies, technologies in China, whereas we have accepted TikTok, for example, as one platform that is all over the place, particularly impacting youth in a very big way.
That's perfect. Actually, this segues exactly into a discussion about decoupling and a couple of things about, sort of executive orders. The other executive order was a few years back under the Trump administration when he issued the executive order about WeChat and TikTok. And the first thing we did was wake up in the morning was, what, a Chinese internet company has how many registered users in the United States of America? So that was a shocker. But to specifically answer the question about decoupling and de-risking, and we've had this conversation with Chinese government. I've had this conversation with Chinese government officials, and they come to the American Chamber and wag the finger, and the Chinese ambassador to the U.S. Visited us, and he says, we need you to go talk some sense into your officials in Washington, D.C. and stop this decoupling business. It's not good for you. It's not good for us. It's not good for anybody. And our response was, look, with respect, we agree with you. We're not fans of decoupling either. But with respect, look who's talking. What do you call the Great Firewall if that's not decoupling? You, Beijing, have successfully isolated your entire digital economy. What do you call that if it's not decoupling? So that's met with a long silence in Beijing. They don't want to have that conversation, obviously. But where we are now, you asked, is it realistic? Is it? Yes, it is. It's actually, is it desirable? No. Will it ever be complete? No. I think we're already pretty deep into our integration with these two economies. But it is the reality right now, and largely because it's not a, I mean, there's some foreign companies that are pulling out of China, but it's more actually the model that Sean and others were talking about earlier, the Sequoia and GGV model, where they're separating their China business from the rest of the world. And that's actually driven more out of Beijing than it is out of Washington. So when I was in China over the summer, I was having a conversation with a CEO of a Fortune 50 company. And he said he had just issued an order for all his China-based staff that if they leave China for business trip, vacation, whatever, no electronics, no phone, no iPad, no computer, cannot take anything with you. Stone tablet, chisel, fine. No phone. And that's a response to China's law on data localization. What they're looking to do is really completely separate the China business so that they can control it with basically what's happening in the rest of the world. So that's a type of decoupling. And I think that's what you're seeing as the reality. So you're seeing a lot of the large foreign companies are no longer, so they're still in China, they're still producing in China, they're taking advantage of the China market. And I don't think that's actually ever going to change, despite the authoritarian nature of the government, despite whatever kind of misery they want to put on foreign executives. I think the foreign companies are still going to stay. What they're not going to do, or what they're going to change, is they're going to much less produce in China for the rest of the world for non-China markets. And so the three exceptions to that right now, I think Sean mentioned Tesla, which is utilizing their capacity in China on batteries and EV vehicles to support markets outside of China. Apple is a notable exception for the time being. And GM, which is doing the same thing as Tesla, which is basically utilizing their capacity for EV production in China for other markets. But other large foreign companies are really becoming disconnected.
Let me. Right. So the question is, isn't that the first step to localize?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, nationalize, yeah, and separate, nationalize, and sort of own, yeah, because localization has been happening for many, well, decades, yeah.
So let me, I see we have about 4 minutes left, and I want to ask a question, which is the private sector in China has always, there's always been a blurry line between being private and being public, right? And a lot of companies operate maybe with financing of public banks and state-owned banks. And maybe the last decade, as you were mentioning, the Chinese tech industry became huge. I mean, these backed companies, Baidu and Tencent and Alibaba, became even stronger than the US giants. It seemed for a while that China was going to overcome. And then the Chinese government and Xi Jinping said, you are no longer in charge. It's I who is in charge. And people like Jack Ma is out, and a lot of the CEOs are out. The Chinese government is taking golden shares. So in corporate governance, they are now on the board of these companies. And so what's going on in the private, what's going on in the private sector in China? We see tycoons that are disappeared.
Yeah.
And the question is, even for Chinese competitivity, how is that even working out?
Yeah,
Three of you.
this segues perfectly with what, and I think that's actually what you're talking about, right? With localization. And I'll make a quick comment about Jack Ma, and then we'll hear from others about on that topic. But everybody focuses on the speech where Jack Ma disrespected some of the financial regulators, and that's true. That was the trigger, but that actually wasn't the the bigger reason was that when Jack Ma traveled outside of China, he would show up in foreign countries and he was treated like a head of state. And that is what you cannot do in a country that's not, that the CCP has a very thin skin. And so when they see that, they've got a history. I mean, I think the tech tycoons got the most attention, but this, you know, you get less attention from the less sexy companies like Huawei and others, where the same thing has happened, where these very, very successful entrepreneurs start going around saying, I'm a genius, I'm brilliant, look at this great business that I built. And the CCP comes along and says, wait. You're successful because we let you be successful. And they've spent, you know, in some cases, in the case of some of the companies, they spend, you know, 5-6 weeks in someplace. In others, you know, they disappear for longer. But I don't know, you guys have thoughts?
In 2013, shortly after Xi took power, the reins of the party state institutions, the Central Committee had a big meeting on economic reform, and it issued this decision that declared that the market was going to be in command of the allocation of resources and the footprint of state-owned enterprises was going to be shrunk. And a couple years later, they reversed course, right? And the emphasis is on building up the state sector as the vanguard of China's economic and technological development. I agree with something Kerr said earlier. I think it's ideological. I think Xi has embraced an assumption that China is engaged in a protracted struggle with incompatible Western systems and focused on potential internal threats like these rising entrepreneurs. And I think he believes that to achieve China's national power goals, the party state has to take more control over how economic resources are allocated and how business decisions are made. And we have 20 seconds left, so there's a whole range of examples we could cite about how, but I think this is part of a collective effort to achieve China's aspirations by ensuring state, private sector, citizens are moving in one direction to advance the government's aims. The growth is slow, yeah.
Well,
So the question, I'm going to repeat it, is if Taiwan has a nuclear bomb, how does China and threatens to use it? How does that China? Yeah. Right. How does China respond if Taiwan has nuclear capability? That's tricky.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think that dynamic there. I mean, China's obviously not worried about Taiwan attacking mainland China, but how they would react to that. I mean, that's still not a declaration of independence. It's a declaration of belligerence, but it's not independence. I think they're still mostly sensitive around that, the I word. So that's really the big one.
I want to use Hartley. I want to hear you out on your thoughts on the uncoupling question and what do you see in the front end from the clients? How do you see that evolving with different clients that you have?
So I think we see it playing out with law enforcement having the increased focus with defendants. I mean, once a case is charged, really so much goes into the prosecutorial discretion of charging these cases. And that's where we're really seeing the focus. Once it's charged, it's just for the most part going to go through the normal channels. Now, when there is a state-owned enterprise or a partially state-owned enterprise that is the target of an investigation or has actually been charged as a defendant, one of the things that we see more happening in criminal cases is kind of the political lobbying alongside of it. Sometimes that is, blatant, and other times it's kind of more of a behind the scenes and having industry experts do it on their behalf, so it has a little bit more credibility. But that's those are some of the things that tend to play out where a case really involves a Chinese target or a Chinese defendant. And I think the uncoupling aspect of it really comes into play with the focus on prosecutorial discretion.
All right. Well, with that, I want to thank the panel. Thank you for sticking with us. And there's obviously a lot of more questions. I also want to thank the people who are watching, because it's going to end now. Now we're going to have a session that is not being videotaped with our agents who are going to join us now in the panel. Thank you very much. Thank you.